All right, so let's get started then. Among the challenges that that coronavirus has created, and the many institutions that it has caused to close. So one case where there was a major question as to what would happen, how the community would respond to the challenges of coronavirus is the case of mikvah. And mikvah comes in a few different varieties. And mikvah is used for tevilas kalim, and for men going to the mikvah in certain communities, and for women going to the mikvah in halachically observant communities. And so we're going to examine for the next hour or so. We're going to examine the responses of different communities, and there's some outliers, but there's largely been one direction of response, although with complex issues and complex details. The communal response to this challenge of mikvah and what to do about mikvah in a world during a pandemic. So I'll share the handout. Things came to a head really as soon as there was a decision made in some communities to close down shuls and close down all other religious institutions. So the question was, what about mikvah? And in a fascinating way and strikingly, the RCBC, which to its great credit, was the first institution to voluntarily shut down its shuls, getting ahead of the curve in order to flatten the curve. So the RCBC, we'll see this later on the handout, when they closed down the shuls, they said we're keeping the mikvah open. So that's really a striking data point, and let's try to understand why, of all the things, and when everything was closing down in the Jewish community, mikvahs, at least for certain operations, have overwhelmingly stayed open. And we'll start by talking about tevilas kalim, dipping of one's utensils in order to allow one to use them after acquiring them. We'll start with that. We'll then talk about men's mikvahs, and those two are we'll see are there's been different responses, and then we'll move to women's mikvahs, spend the most time on that, and in some ways there's the highest stakes on that issue. So as I mentioned, the mikvahs stayed open when the community closed down, although within a couple of weeks, by March 23rd, this is just an example, the Englewood mikvah updated the community and said that it would be closing the kalim mikvah. It said even though the Tinek kalim mikvah would stay open, but this was the beginning of a trend of many communities closing their kalim mikvah, right? So when you buy a new item, a new utensil of a certain sort, you're supposed to take it to the mikvah to tovel it before using it, and that opportunity was no longer being granted in communities. And Tinek kalim mikvah stayed open then, but later on it closed down. So the question became, well, the reason for that was, once it became clearer that there were risks of really any sort of human interaction, there was a risk associated with it, given the relative weight of tevilas kalim, the need for toveling being not so great. So the right thing to do, it was decided, was essentially to shut down kalim mikvahs. Some kalim mikvahs I think have stayed open, but overwhelmingly they've been closed. The question then becomes, and this is right before Pesach, what does one do without a kalim mikvah? And before Pesach, it's more pressing. Often people, if they're not going to kosher their items for Pesach, they'll buy new items, new kalim for Pesach, but you need to tovel them. So how's one to tovel their kalim if the mikvah for kalim is closed? So essentially there have been two approaches. One, this was very popular in Israel. It was promoted in a bunch of different places. So here's one website called eTevila in Israel. I think there's a pun here, a double pun. eTevila, first of all, E like online, right? And also E in Hebrew can mean not. So it's sort of like a tevila without a tevila. And they posted an article called Sale of Electric Utensils to Gentiles. This is not their innovation. This is a long-standing conception that generally one needs to be tovel kalim, the utensils that relate to food preparation and eating. Poskim have various approaches on what one can do if there's no situation, there's no opportunity to be tovel, and this comes up with a lot of issues like toasters or sandwich makers, where there's a chance you'll break it in those cases. But here, Machon Tzomet, which is an institution for technology and halacha, they have a solution here, which is the halacha states that a utensil which is jointly owned by a Jew and a Gentile does not require tefillas kalim. Right? Tefillas kalim is only necessary for items previously owned by a non-Jew, then acquired by a Jew. If it still has non-Jewish ownership, it doesn't need tefillah. The Tzomah Institute has organized a way for the public to appoint the Institute as their agents to sell a portion of the utensil to a Gentile, give them permission to use the entire device. So, we're used to this idea of appointing a rabbi to sell chametz before Pesach, but this, in a sense, just extended that idea. You appoint a rabbi or the Tzomah Institute to sell your devices that need tevilah. And they talk about what cases it's better to do, what cases it's not. But this is one approach that some took. The other approach, Rav Hershel Schachter of YU didn't particularly like that idea, but he has a somewhat different suggestion. First of all, of course, one can try to tovel, even if the mikveh is not open, you can tovel utensils in a body of water. So if you can go in, you go to the local lake or something like that, that's an option too. But I think at this point that wouldn't necessarily be so advisable either. We'll talk about that later. But the Shulchan Aruch talks about transferring ownership to a non-Jew. However, this is not necessarily a reasonable option at a time when people are committed to maintaining standards of social distancing. I think the idea there was it's preferable, if you're going to transfer ownership, preferable that you do it in person with a handshake and that sort of thing, so that wouldn't work so well. So Rav Schachter suggests a different option. It's permitted to use utensils that have not been immersed after renouncing ownership of the utensils. You'd be mafkir, you give up your ownership of the utensils, and that way, if you don't own them, there's no need for you to be tovel them. So you'll be using them, but in practice, but in theory, you don't own them. And there's some conditions here. You have to have full intent that you're really declaring them ownerless, and they have to declare it to 3 people in your neighborhoods that it's sort of public, it's publicly known, 2 of the people are witnesses, and interestingly, this is really part of a different topic, but it doesn't have to be done in front of 3 people in person. It can be declared over email or social media to 3 people. So that's interesting in terms of defining public, that social media counts. And once you declare them ownerless, you should remove them out of your house and leave them outside so someone can theoretically take them and then take them back in and use them. The story, they tell the story, some people are concerned about toveling things like glass soda bottles or other drinks, soft drinks, when they used to come in glass. Doesn't really happen much anymore. So some people, most people don't tovel them, but some people think you need to tovel them. So one workaround is to be mafkir, to give up ownership of your glass utensil. The story is told about my Rabbi Rav Lichtenstein that he, I don't remember the specifics of the case, he was mafkir, he gave up ownership of various utensils so there wouldn't be an issue of tevilah. And one year, some yeshiva students came on Purim and took all his things that he had been mafkir because he doesn't own them anymore, right? He gave up ownership, and he didn't object. And then they tried to return them later, and then he objected. He said, "Don't give it back to me. You acquired it fair and square. It was it was ownerless, and you picked it up." So this is a bit of a workaround. It's a bit of a loophole, but if you treat it seriously, then maybe you really are giving up ownership. So those are the 2 workarounds that were suggested for those who can't tovel in a kalim mikvah because it no longer was safe. There's the option of either selling or giving up part of the utensil to a non-Jew, or of giving up ownership altogether and being mafkir. So much for that. There wasn't a major controversy there, although I think some places decided to keep their utensil kalim mikvahs open, maybe where they thought it was safer or they were less concerned, but there were no major debates there. Let's move on to men's mikvahs, where there's a bit more of a debate. So this generally in Hasidic, especially in Hasidic communities, there's a practice where men go to the mikvah every day before davening. That's a common practice. And if you think about what that means in terms of numbers, you have a large, dense community and densely populated community and one men's mikvah, and so you have hundreds and hundreds of people who go in every day in the morning. So that's really, in terms of public health risk of people interacting during a pandemic, there's very, very major risk there. So in Israel, Israel's religious ministry went back and forth as they were learning more about coronavirus. First they closed down the men's mikvahs completely. Then they opened them up again. They sort of went back and forth a couple times. So if you look at different dates, there's different guidance. They said on March 23rd, so we only have 5 men in the mikveh building at a time. And they have to be 2 meters away from each other, trying to implement some sort of standards. And then that obviously didn't work terribly well. And a couple weeks later, April 2nd, the Israel's religious ministry came out again and said, Chal Isur liftoch mikvot gvarim. You can't open men's mikvahs. All men's mikvahs need to be closed. Presumably, the idea was it would be impossible to enforce the guidelines, and maybe even if you could enforce them, there would be a risk. So they decided to close down the men's mikvahs. Now, what's at stake here? So the minhag, it's based on a practice of Ezra that men are presumed to become ritually impure, and even though ritual impurity is not generally practiced nowadays, still there's a practice, a minhag to go to the mikvah. So that's the practice there. And the question is, what happens if you close down the men's mikvahs and you have some men who still want to tovel? So a few different things happen. First of all, this news article, I didn't quote it at length, but bli chitui bli begadim charidim tovlim b'mikvaot kelim. So this has happened before many times in many different places, but one of those places has been in Israel, where in places where the kelim mikvah was open, the kelim mikvah was usually just a small little tub. Some charidim who would generally want to go to the mikvah, since their men's mikvah was closed, they would go to their local kelim mikvah, not set up for human use, and would jump right in. I've heard such stories about all sorts of kelim mikvahs. In a case of need, you jump in, and it's happened before. Obviously, that's not safe at all, especially if multiple people are doing it. But that's one result. That's one thing that happened. If you look, there's actually a discussion among different poskim and different Halakhic thinkers in the Haredi community as to what to do, how to deal with the situation. And so this article, source number 7, Rav Chaim Kanievsky, sort of recognized as the gadol, as the leader of the Haredi world. So he said, and this is on March 18th. Again, this went back and forth in Israel. He said, men shouldn't go to the mikveh at this point in time. And his basis was chamira sakanta meisura, that in halacha we have a general principle that we treat danger more stringently than we treat prohibitions. Now there's a longer story to be told about Rav Chaim Kanievsky first saying to keep all institutions open and then changing his mind. Without going into those details, at whatever the timing and logic was, he decided that kelim mikvah should be closed because they are unsafe. And then this article goes on in some detail, talks about one of his students, Rav Kook, not the famous Rav Kook, who spoke about what to do instead. So, what about, an alternative? Instead of using a mikvah, can you use a shower? Can a shower head serve to do this tevilah, which is, the Gemara talks about pouring 9 kavim. That's a certain measurement of water on oneself, and that can work for tevilas Ezra. Not for women's tevilah, but for tevilas Ezra, pouring 9 kavim, pouring that amount of water on your head can work. So does that work here in a shower? It needs to be done with a kli, with a utensil that draws that much water. You can't use a shower head, which is sort of pouring it down. Instead, you need to get some sort of bin and pour it on your head. So that's one opinion, that shower heads don't work. However, others, including Nisim Yechiel ben Shimon, who I hadn't heard of previously, but he published a book or a short sefer with different halachas relating to coronavirus. So he talks about how one can use the shower to pour the tisha kavim, and he says it's a general sort of backup plan that one can use. But you just stand right under the water of the shower. How long do you need to be there? He talks about 50 seconds. I heard some people, Rav Asher Weiss said 5 minutes. And he notes there's a dispute here. Rav Yashiv says it doesn't work, but so even though some people don't like the idea of using the shower because it needs to be in a utensil, poured on in a utensil, still in a case where it's impossible otherwise, it still works. So there are two views as to how one can do it for communities where men use the mikvah. But again, the overall practice, the big major takeaway is that men's mikvahs in Israel and in America, overwhelmingly closed. Again, with some exceptions, with some back and forth, and it's hard to know if there's full, people taking, applying that fully. But at least in theory, those men's mikvahs all closed. And the idea here is this is a minhag. It's a practice. It's not a very severe consequence if one can't use the men's mikvah. And there even are alternatives. There are ways of having the equivalent of a mikvah, either with a shower head or with pouring a big basin of water on oneself. You can get the equivalent of a mikvah. And chamira sakanta meisura, danger, is a very important halachic principle. We treat it more seriously than halachic obligations, all things being equal. And so, generally speaking, the decision was made to close down men's mikvahs. But now, if we go to women's mikvahs, we'll see that it's a very different story, a different approach. So if we go back, and I mentioned this before, the first statement about closing religious institutions that was done voluntarily, certainly in the U.S., the RCBC, Rabbinical Council of Bergen County. So they wrote on March 12th, and if you look, they said everyone's encouraged to work from home, to stay home, to not go to school, to not have play groups. Shul is closed. There should be no house minyanim, no public celebrations, no group Shabbos meals, no shiva visits in person, no levayas. Essentially, all religious and other experiences that involve human interaction are canceled or to be done remotely rather than in person. Restaurants should close. No contact sports. The one exception at the end of the list here is the Mikvah will remain open at the guidance of the CDC and local health authorities, right? So the major exception is mikvahs stay open. Women under mandatory quarantine or experiencing symptoms of illness may not use the mikvah. We'll get to that more later, but obviously people who are sick, that would be a bad idea for them to use the mikvah. That would potentially spread it. Please consult your Rav for further clarification. So we're going to get into those details now, but the first thing that stands out, you read this letter from the RCVC. If you knew nothing about Judaism, you would say, well, what is it about these mikvaot? What is it about the mikvah that stays open when everything else is canceled? All other religious experiences that are done communally are closed down. The only one that stays open is the mikvah. Why is the mikvah different, and what's the logic here? So we'll see. There's a few different discussions that tie into this question. One question is, can mikvahs be safe? Obviously, the general halachaism, and this keeps coming up, if there's a clear danger to someone's life, that overrides all halachos except for quote unquote the big three, right? So except for murder, sexually prohibited activities, and idolatry. So this actually may qualify as one of those three, which is a complicating factor. But generally, if there's real threat to someone's life, we'd certainly try to figure out different ways of doing things. There would be the goal would be to find a workaround, a way that wouldn't endanger anyone's life. So the first question is, are the mikvahs safe? And how would that be determined? How can one make sure that they're as safe as possible? So that's one question. The other question will be, are there alternatives to mikvah use? Either an alternative, just like with men's mikvahs, a way of having something that's not quite a mikvah, but that's not in a public place, but that can accomplish the same thing as a mikvah. And alternatively, for those who don't use the mikvah, is there a way of having sort of a different result than one would usually have? So we're going to look at those discussions. So the first question is the question of safety. Is the mikvah safe? And this question, I think, as far as I can tell, was raised much more clearly and loudly in Israel than in America, likely because the circumstances were different. So let's take a look at a couple of articles coming out of Israel. This source number 10 article from Jerusalem Post. The coronavirus pandemic has far-reaching consequences, talking about mikvahos, ritual baths, women immersed once a month after their menstrual cycle has ended. And it says the question became more acute this week after it emerged that a woman who had been infected with coronavirus but was asymptomatic immersed in a public mikvah nefrat, meaning that other women who had immersed there had to go into quarantine. So there was early on, March 30th, 31st, and this happened before then, because it was reported then, there was a case, at least one case in a public mikvah where coronavirus spread, where the mikvah served as a vector for spreading the disease. And it says that the health ministry released a statement that 1% of cases of spreading coronavirus happened in a mikvah, meaning about 3 cases of 3 cases where coronavirus was spread in a mikvah. So what in the wake of those facts, two people, Dr. Chana Adler-Lazarowitz and Rabbanit Sarah Siegel-Katz, looked into some of these details, and they decided, based on what they found at that time, they ruled that women should refrain from immersing in mikvahot if they cannot be certain that the requisite hygiene standards are adhered to in light of the coronavirus pandemic. If you can't be sure that your mikvah is following the standards, there's a real problem. And one of the things that they noted is that here, just scrolling down a bit, 75% of public mikvahot do not have a requisite operating license as of 5 years ago. So essentially, the way things work in Israel, they were arguing it's the Wild West. There's no standards, or there are standards, but they're not followed. 3/4 of mikvahs don't have an operating license. And if they don't have an operating license, you have every reason to worry that they're not disinfecting, that they're not cleaning properly, that they're not following whatever procedures are supposed to be put in place to ensure that it doesn't spread between people. So that was their, back in March, that was their position, and they publicized it, and for good reason. This led to a real shakeup in the Dati Leumi community. So first, there was Rav Eliezer Melamed, a major posek. He said, since the commandment for women to immerse after a menstrual cycle is so crucial, it should not be postponed. Don't push off going to the mikveh because of these worries, because it's such an important mitzvah or requirement. And we're not going to go through the article in super detail, but basically they both were making arguments from silence. Lazarowitz and Siegel-Katz said, well, it doesn't say, the government didn't say that you could use the mikvahs. They didn't say it was safe. And Rav Melamed said the government didn't say it was unsafe. So there was a lot of confusion at that early stage, and a lot of people spoke up, both individuals and leaders, saying that there seems to be a real problem here. How can we use the mikvahs if they're actually unsafe, if people are spreading coronavirus through the mikvahs? So that was early on, and I think what resolved that issue, both in Israel, where it was a major issue, and in America, where there were people worried as well, especially people who heard that there have been cases in Israel, and people are just worried generally. There's a lot of, we don't know that much about coronavirus. Maybe it can spread through a mikvah. And so the response to those worries, as far as I can tell, has been largely through people doing the research, trying to figure out as much as possible how, what the risks are and how best to counteract them. So in an article in The Atlantic, which itself is striking, that The Atlantic is a sort of a general interest American magazine, they ran an article about women in mikvah. So they write as follows, as a response to some of the concerns that they lay out earlier in the article. Many Jewish leaders believe that mikvah immersion is safe. Lila Kashdan, a rabbi who works as a bioethicist at several hospitals, has spent recent weeks advising rabbis and mikveh directors around the country about how to handle the coronavirus crisis. She constantly monitors the latest guidelines from the CDC and local governments. And her findings are, as are spelled out, mikvahs are not distinctively risky, right? The water is not really unsafe. You can't really, apparently, coronavirus doesn't spread through water. That's the government guidance, and especially in mikvahs where the water is chlorinated or brominated, it can't, that would kill any coronavirus, so it can't spread through the water. The question then is, okay, but maybe it can spread, just through the air like anywhere else. And for that reason, so the various guidance was from Lila Kashdan and from others. The guidance was to make sure to disinfect everything in the mikvah between people who go, and to not have multiple people in a room at a time in order to minimize as much as possible the risks. So we'll get more into this question about details of protocols and whatnot, but the most mikvahs, the overwhelming majority of mikvahs, remained open. It notes here some mikvahs found the risks of immersion to be intolerable. So Mayim Chaim, a pluralist egalitarian mikvah in Boston, decided in late March to close. But that's the exception. Overwhelmingly, and especially within the Orthodox mikvahs, Orthodox affiliated mikvahs, mikvahs have remained open, and largely due to the efforts of people like Lila Kashdan, who who tried to figure out as many details as possible, who stayed up to date on the guidance as to what would be safe and what would be unsafe. And the stakes here obviously are very high. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but under traditional Jewish law, under halacha, if a woman needs to go to the mikveh due to her menstrual cycle and doesn't go to the mikveh, so she's prohibited to her husband, which both means sexual activity, but also means, in the general case, means any sort of touching or other harchakos, other ways that the couple's supposed to distance from one another. So that can be a major strain on a relationship. And certainly for women who are trying to get pregnant, that would create an insurmountable problem. But even just for regular marital continuity, it's a real challenge to not have for the woman to not be able to go to the mikvah. So there's a real need on that side, and that many women have expressed that many women want to go to the mikvah. So this is expressed well by Ruth Belinsky-Friedman, and both she and Lala Kashin are graduates of Maharat, and both have taken, I think, as far as I can tell, leadership roles, representing the issues and representing the voices of women and their congregants, and coming up with policies. So this is Ruth Belinsky-Friedman. Although people outside of the Orthodox community might say that these women should just stay home, going to the mikvah is not optional in the way that praying together in synagogue or attending family gatherings is, according to Ruth Belinsky-Friedman at Ohev Shalom. I very much understand the impulse to see religion as more symbolic, something we do when we're able to, but in time of crisis we put aside, she said, but you can't cancel the commandments governing sex. She said, that's the word of God. So I think due to both the great need for people to be able to have access to a mikvah, to a women's mikvah, and given the safety concerns being allayed, that's the reason why overwhelmingly mikvahs have remained open. And in Israel, going back to Israel, Dr. Dina Zimmerman, a Yoetzet Halacha, as far as I can tell, she was the one who did a lot of the research and coming up with standards and making sure that the standards are implemented, which of course in Israel was the main issue, but making sure that every mikvah was following, as much as possible, was following the standards in order to make sure that it was safe in Israel as well. So that's the question of safety. And of course, this is not convincing to everyone. There are some who have published articles or declared publicly that they think that mikvahs are not safe and should not be used. I saw a different graduate of Maharat, Dr. Carmela Abraham, suggested that people not use the mikvah. But those are more marginal voices. Certainly within Orthodoxy, those are the more marginal voices that saying that no one should use a mikvah, that it's unsafe for use. We'll get more, going further, we'll get to what sort of the options that individuals have had. But in terms of keeping the mikvahs open, the overwhelming position of people across the board has been, it's safe enough to use for those who want to use it. It should be an option, and that's been the question of safety, the way it's been generally decided. Although there have been some dissenting voices, and certainly many people have been worried, and for good reason. This is a new pandemic. We don't know how it works, how the disease works. So that's the safety question. Now the other question, and there was a few different proposals for this, is let's say you can't use a mikvah, which could be theoretically if you think that all mikvahs are unsafe now, or if you even if mikvahs generally are safe, what about for a person who's in quarantine or is immunocompromised? Maybe for those people, they either not allowed to or it would be unsafe for them to use the mikvah because of their increased personal risk. So in those cases where there is no option, theoretical or practical, no option of mikvah, what alternatives might exist? And so there were a few different proposals. We're not going to go into too much detail on these because you could write entire contrasim 50-page books about these things, and some have. But we'll just try to get the general principles, the major issues at hand that come up in these questions. So one view, both Rav Chaim Ovadia and I think more publicly and more prominently Rav Chaim Amsalem, former member of Knesset in Israel, have different suggestions as to how how a woman might go to the mikvah, not in the mikvah, but have an equivalent of a mikvah in a bathtub, in a home bathtub. So before we get into the details of the proposal, let's take a look at some classical sources here. What does one need, a woman who wants to go to the mikvah after being a nida to resume regular relations with her husband? What's needed for a mikvah in that case? So the Rambam writes, Din Torah shekol mayim michunasim tovlim bahem shenever mikvah mayim mikol makom. Any body of water that's gathered together biblically works as a mikvah. And how much do you need? You need guf ha'adam bevas achas. You need to dunk the entire body at once within the water. Shiru chachamim ama burom shalosh amos. What's the average size of a person is 3 cubic amos. 1 amma by 1 amma by 3 amos. An amma is somewhere between 1.5 feet and 2 feet. So that amount of 3 cubic amos. V'shir zehu machzik mem sa mayim. That's 40 sa of water. There are different views on this, and this is partially relevant to our discussion, but the smallest estimation of 40 sa is, I hope I'm getting my numbers right, is 80 gallons, and the highest number is 170 something gallons. And if you know how big your normal size bathtub is, it is smaller than either of those measurements. Hold that thought. That's biblically speaking. Biblically speaking, any body of water, of gathered water, works for a mikvah. However, next halacha, midivrei sofrim, rabbinically, or whatever midivrei sofer means, somewhere between rabbinically or maybe a bit more than rabbinically, she'amayim ha'she'uvim psulim l'tefila, water that's gathered that doesn't naturally fall into your pool or mikvah, but which you gathered, you brought there, you scooped up that water and poured it in yourself. Those are pasul midrabanan, rabbinically not acceptable. The Rambam, that's the Rambam's view, that the problem with Mayim She'uvim is that it's a Durabanan problem. So if I were to go outside and, draw water out of the ground and then put it into a pool, 40 sa for a mikvah, that would not work rabbinically, according to the Rambam. Others, drawing on source 14, but others as well, talks about if one gathers water on their shoulder and then makes a mikvah out of that, I would think that would work. It has to happen automatically through heaven, not through human use. And that sounds like there's a biblical problem with filling up a mikvah with water on your own. The Shulchan Aruch seems to pass like the Rambam. The 40 sa. You can't have drawn those waters. They're not valid. They're not good if they're drawn. But it sounds like he would just say midrabanan, rabbinically following the Rambam. And the Rama argues on him and says, if the whole thing is drawn, that would be biblically problematic. And he says, without going into those details, there's a dispute as to whether a mikveh that you draw the water for is biblically or rabbinically problematic. So that's one problem. So there's a few different problems here, right? When you need a mikveh, let's say you want to make a mikveh in your bathtub. So how would you do that? So one issue is you need to make sure that there's 40 sa, that there's the requisite amount of water, and that the person would be able to dip into that. And that's one issue. Another issue is the water can't be she'uvim. It can't be drawn. Now, what do you say about tap water? Is tap water she'uvim? Is tap water drawn or not? So on the one hand, there's some human action that's necessary in making it happen. On the other hand, you're not really drawing it. You're sort of releasing a pressure valve, and then the water is by itself entering your house. But on the other hand, depending on how the water system is set up, very often the way these things work is that there's a water tank that holds the water, and once you have the water held inside a kli, inside a utensil, that counts as she'uvim. But that would depend on whether it's set up like a utensil or not. Is it really a kli? Is it really a utensil holding the water, or is it more just a way of the water passing through? There are both practical and conceptual questions that need to be answered to respond to that issue. And yet one more challenge that comes up, source 16 here, kol kli matachos sheyesh lo shem b'fnei atzmo tameh. Any metal item that has a name by itself, meaning it's considered its own item, is impure, meaning can become impure, which also means that it's a kli, it counts as a utensil. Chutz min hadelos u'min hanagar, except for doors and other things, min hamodel, a lock, v'aposta shetachas atzir, v'atzir v'akor atzin, or shenasu l'karka. There's an exception for certain items, certain utensils that if they're made, they're nasu lakarka, they're made for the purposes of installing in the ground, then they might not count as a utensil. So the question here is as follows. What is the status of a bathtub? Right, a bathtub it looks like a utensil, right? It's a large tub, right? Tubs hold things, tubs are utensils. So isn't there a problem of you put the water in your bathtub, the bathtub itself is a utensil. So one possible argument to argue against that is to say, well, it's nasela karka, is that the bathtub it's not really meant to be used as a separate tub. They have those old school tubs with the feet. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a normal bathtub that you install. It's meant to be installed in the ground. So maybe that doesn't count as an independent utensil. That just counts as sort of part of the ground, in which case there wouldn't be a problem. So there's a big question there. One of my teachers, or Danny Wolf, thinks that would resolve that problem. Others disagree. But so there's several different problems here. If we take a step back and look at the big picture, number one, you need to get enough water in your mikvah, in your bathtub. You need to have 40 sa in the bathtub. Number two, it can't be she'uvim. It can't be drawn water, however you define that. And number three, the bathtub itself cannot count as a kli, as a utensil. So you'd have to argue that it counts as attached to the ground. Rav Chaim Amsalam, in his lengthy essay, B'charta B'chaim, Choose Life, he argues that there's room to allow for being tovel in one's bathtub. Except he doesn't quite say it that way. He says he has a few different formulations. He jumps back and forth. But let's read at least a couple of places where he discusses his ruling. So he says, in normal times, one needs to be tovel in a valid mikveh. If you don't have this option, like during coronavirus, where all mikvahs are closed, given governmental decision, and health officials, due to danger. So if you see that there's no mikvahs open, and you cannot withstand the challenge, meaning that I guess a couple where the wife is tameh, is a nida, wants to, sees they can't withstand the normal restrictions without the wife going to the mikvah. So he says, "Ha'itzahi litbol be'ofanim hamuvim l'maskana." So the suggestion is to be tovel, for the wife to be tovel on the standards that I'll discuss, in order to minimize the sin. Meaning, this is not fully permissible. What I'm suggesting is for someone who's going to be sexually intimate anyway, this is less severe than the alternative of not doing this. So that's, here it doesn't sound like he's actually permitting. Ein kan horat heter gorefet. This is not a wide-ranging permission. El horat shah bilvad, a temporary suspension. Umaneh hilchati letzorchei ha'am ha'mishavin lefitaron. And a response for people who are looking for some solution. Elsewhere he says, I'm not talking to charedim, I'm talking to traditional Jews who, try to keep the halakha but are not absolutely stringent or something like that. So I think for reasons of time, we're not going to look into all the details here, but essentially he argues as follows. He finds many sources, especially among Sephardic rabbis throughout the generations, but then also some others, including many American rabbis in a later draft, where they allow using tap water for the mikveh. So this is the issue we talked about before. Does tap water count as she'uvim, as drawn, which would invalidate it or not? And he shows a whole bunch of rabbis who allowed tap water. So he says, okay, if the tap water is allowed, so that's she'uvim, so that's not a problem. And even if you think she'uvim is a problem, it's only d'Rabbanan, because we paskin, we hold like the Rambam we saw before. Question whether she'uvim is a biblical problem or a rabbinic problem. Says it's only a rabbinic problem, worst case, so that's not so bad. And he says this, he only says in some versions of some formulations, he's a little inconsistent. And you might say that needing 40 sa'ah, needing 80 gallons of water, which most bathtubs don't have, you might say that's also only d'Rabbanan. Maybe that's not biblically mandated, that's only rabbinically mandated. It's possible to read that into the Rambam. That's not the standard view. So if you say all those things, then maybe it's better to have the wife be tovel in the bathtub and at least downgrade the prohibition to rabbinic instead of continuing without that and continuing sexual activity without that, which would be biblically prohibited. That's his suggestion. It's not exactly clear. Is he really saying this is not a permission? this is just a way of minimizing the prohibition, or is he sort of through the back door trying to say this is a permission too? Not fully clear. Here's where he says that it's not for the Haredi community. It's in big bold letters in the original. So there's different formulations here. One of the interesting things he says, I'm not making this decision on my own. This will only be valid if three great rabbis sign off on it. One of them, the most prominent, is Rav Eliyahu Abergel. And if that name rings a bell, it's because he was one of the signatories on the Zum Heter, also the most prominent. He's the chief judge of rabbinical courts of Jerusalem, a very prominent position. And so he was asked to sign off. So his haskama, his approbation of sorts, appears early on in the publication of Rav Amslam. He says, "Ra'iti v'yanti v'kuntres v'charti v'chayim ma'aseh adav shel Rav Hagaon, etc., etc. Rav Chaim Amslam Shlita b'tshuva l'sheila liyudim anitzaim b'makom she'ein lehem mikvah." So this is a question addressed to Jews in a place where there's no mikvah. Now already this is suspicious because this would not be relevant to Israel or America or any large Jewish community, right? All major Jewish communities have a mikvah open, as far as I know. So he's sort of limiting his response to a community with no mikvah. V'gam mikvah rachok mimachos chef. It's too far away. Right? Everything's closing down given the dangers. They can't withstand the test. And he says that they can allow, he says they should allow certain things until the time is over. Now, he says, he says, okay, this is his essay about situations where there's no mikvah, and this is how he wants to minimize the prohibition. And that's what he says. So he doesn't, and here's a blessing for him. So as several people have noted, this both is not talking about the situation in Israel, or America for that matter, and it's not, he doesn't actually endorse the position. He just says, this is what he says, Bivracha, this is my blessing. So it definitely seems like Rav Abergel was not willing to give a real haskama, a real approbation. This is noted by an essay, I think, not with a cited author, anonymous essay, as far as I can tell, about arguing on Rav Amslam. There's a whole host of things on which they argue, but one of the points was this whole decision was supposed to be only if rabbis agree, and the main rabbi that's supposed to agree, didn't actually agree in his letter. A few of the arguments that were made against, one of them is that you can't just say that all tap water is not shuvim. You need to look into the details in each place. You need to make sure that the tap water doesn't get held in some sort of water tower or water holding item or utensil. Or, for example, in Israel, hot water, what do you do with hot water? You heat it up in the dud shemesh, generally. So that's a utensil, presumably. The dud shemesh, which holds the water, would be a utensil, and that would create a problem of she'uvim. So that's one problem just on his precedents aren't really relevant because they're talking about, they're not necessarily talking about the same situation. He also has different readings of a Rambam and a Tshuva. He also, one of the other objections is that one of the main arguments of Rav Amslam is that it's only rabbinically a problem, so better to do the rabbinic thing than to do the biblical thing. And one of the responses to that is the argument that if you intentionally do something wrong rabbinically, that might not even work biblically. That might not work at all. So that's another argument that's made. And also the question is how, one of the main sources that's drawn upon is Rav Masas, a major Moroccan posek, where he allowed use of tap water for a mikvah, not for a bathtub, for a mikvah in a situation of people who were stranded after a war. And the argument in response is that would only be for people with an extended period of time where they wouldn't be able to be with their spouses. But to just do it for a month or two of separation wouldn't be allowed. So there are many different points that he argues on. It may be a little over the top, but there's major pushback to Rav Amslam. I would add, this only comes up in passing in this letter, but it doesn't address the question of the bathtub itself. That the bathtub might be a kli, the bathtub might be a utensil. So really there are several different issues that are not addressed by Rav Amslam. His decision was not largely followed. It's basically been rejected, but it's important to consider what the alternative might look like. some have noted that, in theory, it wouldn't be too crazy to say that if one figures out whether the water in one's house comes, how the water arrives there, and if it doesn't come through any storage utensils, that would mean that the water would not be she'uvim. And if one has an extra large bathtub, maybe a jacuzzi, something that can hold at least 80 gallons, if not more, and if one makes sure that that there are no other problems, or finds another way of filling the bathtub, maybe with ice that then melts, which some have allowed. There may be ways of having mikvahs in one's house. In fact, in America, 7 years ago, there were attempts to do that, although they ran into similar problems, and that's not the standard. So it seems like the attempt to have mikvahs in one's house has not been accepted as terribly helpful. Certainly not by anyone besides a very, very small number of decisors, and there seem to be problems with that permissive view. So let's move to the next alternative scenario, which is what happens if there's no mikvah, right? So as was mentioned before, under normal circumstances, a woman who's a nida is prohibited to her husband, and that prohibition includes not just sexual activity, but generally even things like the harchakos, even things like holding hands or passing things to each other. And the question is, what happens if there's an extended period of time where the mikvah is not available, again, either because the mikvah itself is unsafe, or generally, or because a woman is immunocompromised and can't go, or for whatever other reason, what does one do in that case? And here, there's been a bit of a debate. So Rav Sperber, who's known as a sort of a left-leaning posek in Israel, permitted in this letter that we're not going to read inside, we'll look at the summary. He permitted that since this is a difficult situation, and since there may only be a rabbinic prohibition on everything other than sexual intercourse itself, there may be room where people would otherwise maybe fall into worse situations or have major challenges of other sorts, mental health or otherwise, or would place too much of a strain on the marriage. There would be room to allow for things like holding hands or even kissing or even sleeping in the same bed while wearing clothes. And that's based on the Ramban, that Isurei Kreva Himrak Midrabanan, that coming contact short of sexual activity are only rabbinically prohibited. And there's a lenient position in the Gemara based that one can attach to that view, that might allow for things here, to stop you from doing a worse sin, a biblical sin, that then maybe there's room to allow coming close. There was a major attack on this view, both from Rav Shmuel Eliyahu, a prominent rabbi in Israel, and he argues on some of the sources, but it sounds like maybe a larger argument on his part is, well, first of all, we don't paskin like that view. We seem to rule in the Shulchan Aruch that there's a biblical prohibition of even the things less than sexual activity. But also he quotes a story, a fascinating story in the Gemara. There was some great rabbi who died young, and they said, why did he die young? And they said, they asked his wife, was he not careful with Hilchos Nida? And she said, no, he was. We never were sexual, never had any sexual activity that was prohibited. So, but what we did do was when I was in Nida, we ate together and drank together and we slept in the same bed. We never had any sexual activity, but we didn't keep the harchakos. And v'amarti baruch hamakom shehargo. Well, that explains why God killed him, because he didn't keep the harchakos. So this Gemara is used to emphasize the severity of these harchakos, as Rav Shmuel Eliyahu points to. And he also says, and I think this may be the main point, that even if you could find room to be lenient in a specific case, this will lead to all sorts of other things. This will lead to other people. Ruba de alma yavinu ki im mutar chibuk v'nishuk im ishto nidai ze mutar gam im ravakot v'gam im eshedish. Then once we allow things short of sexual activity, we allow kissing and hugging with one's wife who's a nida, people will allow it even between two people who are single, or with a man and a woman married to a different man. And it'll get out of hand, right? And once you start allowing A and B, it'll lead to another thing. It's a slippery slope. and it will lead to terrible things. And then he ends, what's your definition of a time of great exigency? Just because the couple wants to have intimacy of some sort, that's shatan chak. You shouldn't allow that. That was his letter, and it was accompanied by this letter, without as many details, but many rabbis across the board in the Dati Leumi world coming out against that view. Now, Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig, who posted in English a helpful analysis of this. We're not going to have time to go through it closely, but basically he says that it seems that the pushback may have been a bit too strong. So he says, let's start with the baseline. There are often cases where, in the normal course of things, including childbirth, a couple is not in physical contact, is not supposed to be physical contact for a lengthy period of time, even a couple of months. Often after having a baby, that can be the case. And but if things go on beyond that point, beyond what's normal, and there's difficulty, he says there may be room in a case-by-case basis to allow for supportive touch rather than affectionate romantic touch. So instead of definitely not kissing, but maybe holding hands, that's not leading to something more than that, so to speak, just holding hands as being supportive. And he's not allowing that as a general rule, he's saying as a case-by-case basis. So my sense is, and this is not publicized in too many places, although it is here, there are some poskim out there who on a case-by-case basis may find leniencies for couples to have at least, to hold hands or something like that, but not to allow for the more not quite sexual, but intimacy of greater forms that the Reb Sperber allowed for. And obviously this depends on community, and I'm sure that some communities are more stringent and say, no, if you're not going to the mikvah, you keep the basic halacha unless there's some major mental health crisis. But at least in some communities, the ones, let's say, that Rav Yoni Rosenzweig and Reb Sperber are serving, it seems like there are people some people who are relying on these leniencies as they don't go to the mikvah. Let's now, for our final piece here, look at, leaving aside these two alternatives, either trying to have a mikvah in a bathtub, which did not catch on too well, or not going to the mikvah and applying some leniencies in terms of intimacy. So what was sort of the main, neither of those were the main approach. Those were sort of, either side approaches or secondary attempts at minimizing, the challenge. But the main approach was to leave the mikvahs open. And we saw before, a lot of that was based on making sure that it was as safe as possible, which is not to say it's absolutely safe, right? Even just walking outside is not absolutely safe. So I think some people have been very careful in saying this is not, we can't promise you that this is absolutely safe. We can't promise you that walking outside is absolutely safe either, but we're making it as safe as possible. And we think that it's very reasonable, following CDC guidelines, very reasonable for people to continue doing this at the rate they are. There was guidance from two different Orthodox organizations that talk globally about how mikvahs should run, namely the OU and RCA and the Yoatzot. And they largely overlap. We'll quickly skim them. But maybe the most important line comes towards the beginning of the OU RCA messaging. They sent out, based on their postskim, to rabbis and for public consumption. Everyone must respect a woman's wish to delay her immersion in the mikvah and resumption of intimacy until the pandemic has passed. The following is shared for the sake of those who wish to continue to access this sacred resource at this time. Meaning, the idea of forcing a woman to go to the mikvah or pressuring a woman to go to the mikvah is absolutely not to be done. Presumably they're saying this because there are people and maybe even communities where this is done, but that is rejected by the OU and RCA. If a woman thinks that it's unsafe, even if the mikvah follows CDC guidelines and every public health professional thinks it's safe, if a woman thinks it's unsafe, she shouldn't be forced or pressured in any way to go to the mikvah. It's an important point, because you wouldn't want there to be a situation where people where women or anyone is forced to do something they think is unsafe for the good of someone else, so to speak. And some of the guidelines here. So only symptom-free people may work in or use the mikvah. If you're not symptom-free, if you're in quarantine, you can't go. All preparations happen at home. No transactions at the mikvah. Everything needs to be freshly sanitized and cleaned. The mikvah attendant who usually checks the woman going to the mikvah, everything should be done at a distance. There should be no touching. And now some special leniencies that aren't usually aren't usually done, which is, although not usually halachically advised, and this is based on Rav Moshe, that one shouldn't do this generally, during the current pandemic, a woman should shower when arriving home, right? Usually, the practice is not to shower after using the mikvah because it's sort of a gzeira. People might think that the shower is what allowed it, not the mikvah itself. In this case, given the pandemic, a woman not only can but should shower when arriving home. Fine, more things. Attendants should wear gloves. There should be proper hand washing. And again, it cites the CDC's guidance that no traces of COVID-19 have been detected in drinking water. There's no evidence that it can be spread to humans through pools or hot tubs. And it doesn't even mention that, oh, you're right, it's also destroyed by chlorine or bromine and filtration. So there's, as far as they can tell, there's no particular reason why the mikveh should be any more unsafe than any other area. They don't quite say these words, but I've heard many people say if you go shopping, this is about the same, if probably less risk than going shopping. If you go shopping, you should feel equally safe, if not more safe, going to the mikveh. One more leniency that comes up in Nishmat's guidelines, in the Yoetzet guidelines, is that a woman, sometimes there are extenuating circumstances where not everyone can go to the mikveh at night. Sometimes in a community with a very heavy volume of mikveh use, because of one of the things that were done was to space out mikveh trips so that you wouldn't have two people there at the same time, and you clean it in between uses. But once you do that, you may run out of hours in the night to go to the mikveh. Usually mikveh is used at night for women at night, but not during the day. So in a case where that wouldn't be possible, let's say strict curfew, immersion during the daytime on day 8 may be permissible. So to wait, if you can't go to the mikveh this night, you wait until the next day and then can go during the day, and there may be room for that as well. Just Rav Shechter here, this is his tshuva allowing showering after going to the mikveh. This is Rav Asher Weiss allowing tevilah on the 8th day during the day instead of during the night. So those between having, making sure that health-wise mikvahs were as safe as possible, and having some flexibility, and having standards to make sure that everything was safe, and having some flexibility on sort of secondary minor halachic issues like going during the day if necessary for spacing, or showering afterwards to ensure safety. Mikvahs have overwhelmingly remained open, and again, not necessarily for everyone. It's a personal choice. It's a personal choice. Those who think they're not safe, or those who actually are not, are medically assumed to be not safe because they're immunocompromised or otherwise. They don't have to use the mikvah. And as we said before, there's somewhat divergent views as to whether there are certain leniencies there or not. I guess I just wanted to close. Oh, and I'll just mention a couple of other points. Some women have sort of shifted their use of birth control to skip their period, which at least for some women is possible, and that's one way of avoiding the whole issue entirely. Even though not everyone advises that. Sometimes some groups do, some don't. But certainly under the current circumstances, to just to use birth control pills or other forms of birth control to just not have a period and not have a need to go to the mikvah is another method that people have been using. Just to end with two final thoughts. One is that this topic, as far as I can tell, it's a bit of an outlier compared to the other topics. First of all, I think it's much less discussed. There's a lot less written on this topic compared to other hot button topics. As it happens, I think as you can tell, many of the participants in these discussions have been women, which is often not the case in Orthodox Halakhic discourse. And a lot of that is a function of the fact that many women through the Yoetzet program, through other programs, are very well trained and work very closely with issues of mikvah. And that really shows in terms of who's stepped up. I'd say Yoetzot and Maharats have stepped up and been leaders on these conversations. But also, there's been a lot less written, a lot less in the public forum. So there could be a couple of reasons for this. I would say two main reasons that come to mind. One would be that generally there's, sometimes people feel that, matters relating to sexual propriety are not so sanua, are not, it's better to keep them quiet and not discuss them. Of course, the cost of that is if people have information they need to know for their own health, mental or physical, they wouldn't know, but that could be one factor. And another factor is, I think we saw in Rav Eliyahu's letter, the slippery slope worry. If you think that there's room to permit in a particular circumstance, given given just human nature and the nature of these things, there's worry that that could be carried over, and people would say, well, if we allow physical touch in this case under coronavirus, maybe we should allow it in all sorts of other cases. So I think those may be a couple of the reasons why there's been not so much discussion here, although there may be further reasons as well. And also I think one of the reasons is that I think the status quo seems to work. Both for people who want to use the mikvahs remain open and as safe as possible. Those who don't want to use the mikvah generally, not always, and I've heard there are some cases not, but generally are able to figure out the proper halakhic guidance to remain safe both physically and mentally. So that may be a factor as well. Just to end with this last point, and then we'll take some questions. Why are mikvahs the last thing to close? And a great article way back in March about why mikvahs are the last things to close, and it points to both people's experience as to really needing the mikvah in order to try to resume, attempting to have children, or those who need it for intimacy. And in general, one of the first things, if not the first thing, to start in a Jewish community when you move in is a mikvah, or a way for women to become ritually pure, to allow resumption of relations with the family. So again, if you looked at the guidance under coronavirus, what closes? Everything closes except for the women's mikvah. And I think it's a function of a few things. Number one, that it's able that both according to the CDC and other experts, mikvahs have, when following guidelines, have been able to remain as safe as possible and probably safer than other experiences, than other things like shopping, and the great need and the centrality of allowing for intimacy within a marriage. So I'm happy to take some questions now if there are. I see someone, John wrote a question. Some of the sources talk about going to mikveh as soon as possible, seemingly because the tumah itself is problematic. The OU RCA guidelines about not forcing women to go as soon as possible seems to be addressed to those people. Is there a basis for saying that women should go to a mikveh as soon as possible, regardless of her personal relationships? So it's a great question, and it touches on a couple of different halachic discussions. One is a discussion in the Gemara about tefillah bisman mitzvah, generally in terms of tefillah, not just in terms of marriage, marital context, but tefillah overall, even for the impurity that we don't practice nowadays, doesn't need to be done. Ideally, is it a mitzvah to do it on the first possible day? It's all about chokes in the Gemara. We don't paskin practically that that's the case nowadays. So that idea of tefillah bisman mitzvah doesn't apply in a technical sense. I think there's often, and I think this is something where people will disagree. I just was in touch with someone who's a yoetzet who says we never, obviously people who want to can and should go as soon as possible, but we don't believe women should ever be pressured to go to a mikvah. That's I believe the yoetzet, the yoetzot's official position. I think others might say, well, it's really not fair to, it's not fair to the husband or something like that, arbitrarily the woman would withhold the possibility of intimacy, although you could see how that would lead to all sorts of problems. So that's I think where that view is coming from. So the OU coming out here, and I don't think they formulated it as a general guidance, but at least in these cases, the OU and RCA coming out and saying, under these circumstances, certainly no one should be pressured to go to the mikvah, even if we think it's totally safe. We think it's not a problem, but people have to be comfortable doing it before they do it. This might relate to the question of how we understand pikuach nefesh. There are some views that pikuach nefesh, the idea that you can violate Shabbos or other things due to danger, is subjective. Meaning, even if there's no real danger, if one really feels that there's a danger, within certain cases, that would count as well. So that may be a factor in that decision. But the question is a great question, and this is somewhat of a fraught topic, which does break down generally along right-left lines as far as I can tell. But in this case, certainly the OU RCA came out and said that no woman should feel pressured to go to the mikvah. The mikvahs are open for those who want to use them. I will say, anecdotally, based on asking a few friends who are yoetzot or otherwise involved in their communities, that the numbers are not really down too much from the usual numbers. Meaning there'll be some people who are immunocompromised and can't go, and maybe there's some people who are choosing not to go, but overall, the numbers of women going to the mikvah are close to where they regularly are, at least in the communities that I asked people who are knowledgeable about. Another question from earlier, can you use mafkir on a regular basis for processors, toasters, etc.? And I think technically yes, and I think the guidance is only to use hefker in cases where it's really necessary. Meaning if you're lazy and don't want to go to the mikvah, that's not a good reason to use it. But if it's something like a toaster which might break or something like that, some poskim would say you can just simply be mafkir. Others would say that apparently if you put a toaster in a mikvah and wait a couple of weeks, it doesn't break, but I have not experimented with that enough to know for sure. Okay, a comment from Facebook that's sent my way. It's important to distinguish between tefillah b'kli and mayim she'uvim regarding issues of a bathtub and issues with water. Right, and I agree, they're two separate issues. Number one, being tovel in a kli, if the bathtub counts as a utensil or not, that's one issue. And there's a separate issue of mayim she'uvim, whether the water counts as being drawn. You'd need to solve both of these issues. It's not at all clear that proposals for using a mikvah, using a bathtub as a mikvah, solve certainly not the bath. Well, both of them are questionable, because the bathtub, even if it's meant to be installed, it still was a kli, it was a utensil beforehand, and the source of the water, it depends on where it came from and whether there were water tanks along the way or not. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them. If not, this is the last of the series of Halakhic responses to coronavirus. So it's been a pleasure learning with you these issues in these very challenging times, and may we all be so lucky as to be able to deal with Halakhic issues that are not based on crisis, but are based on healthier times. May we all be very safe and healthy, and everyone should be well.